Thank you, John. I appreciate it. Happy Lundi Gras to everybody. At least it's not raining right now, so that's a good thing. Well, at least it's slightly timely to be here because of the call for the special session on Friday, and so now we know for sure we're going to have we knew we were going to have a special, pretty much knew we were going to have a special session no matter what, be it early or later. But we are going to have it early, and actually I think that's a good thing. I don't think it's a terrible surprise that we're having the one in February. I believe or agree with the governor as he says, if we were not able to begin to deal with some of these fiscal cliff issues before the regular session, that in fact the legislature would not pass a budget during the regular session. They would put it off till afterwards. We'd really be pushing the time frame deadline in terms of doing that. We'd bring a lot of very bad publicity to our state, give the bond rating agencies reasons to say bad things about us, give others to reasons to compare us to like the new Illinois in terms of not being able to do anything with our budget. So I think it was sort of inevitable that somehow they were going to get together and decide to have this special session in February. I don't think that means by any stretch that anything's a done deal, that they've worked anything out in terms of real detail, but I think it looks like anyway that they've been talking enough and enough things are on the table from both sides, both from the Republican leadership in the House and from the governor, obviously, with sort of the framework that he's laid out in terms of tax proposals, that they have the things on the table where they can try to get something done. I'm somewhat optimistic that they will. I mean, I think there are enough reasons to get something done in February that will push them together to do that. But, you know, you never know with this bunch. I thought they would pass a budget last year before the session ended, and of course they didn't do that. They do tend to work on deadline, unfortunately. That was actually an example where they didn't even meet their deadline. But one thing we've seen with the legislature, at least over the last, I would say 2-3 years anyway, is that sort of like journalists, they understand a deadline and they do things literally at the last minute. And you know, used to you could say last minute and use that kind of rhetorically like it was the last minute. But more recently, they've really been doing things at the last minute. And that's always a reason, I think, for concern, especially when we've got so much at stake. But I am reasonably optimistic, you know, that they will work out something. I don't think it's any surprise, actually, that, you know, the governor said, I'm not going to call a session unless I've got 70 votes in the House. I don't think he has 70 votes in the House. But I also think it was probably unrealistic to think that with 105 members in the House that they were going to have a deal that was kind of set in place going into it. I think really and truly you have to have all these things on the table. If you look at the call, it looks like pretty much everything that's kind of been discussed is in the call. And so all those items are on there, and there's plenty of, you know, items in there that we can negotiate and fight over and compromise over and all of those things. So I'm, as I said, reasonably optimistic that they will pass something and get it done. I'm less optimistic that what they pass will be either permanent or really resembling much in the way of tax reform. And I think that's really unfortunate. It's kind of, you know, unfortunate, I think, in the sense that we've got an opportunity, we have a need to do something with our tax structure. You kind of blow whatever value you get of having, you know, one of the lowest tax burdens in the country if you also have one of the worst tax structures, according to the Tax Foundation. Both of those are from the Tax Foundation. So you kind of blow whatever advantage you have by having a low tax burden if your business tax climate, you know, ranks in the bottom 10 of those in the country. So, I mean, our view from CABL and kind of the work that we did working on that HCR 11 task force in 2016 was to try and put together a framework that would both you know, be revenue neutral and take care of whatever needs of the state that the legislature and the governor felt were the appropriate levels, but also do some things to improve our tax structure. And I think even though what we put out was not a plan per se, it was a framework with a lot of things that could be done, some of them in the short term, others were clearly long-term things, that it sort of set the stage in the sense of a framework work to actually do those things to improve our tax structure. And I think that benefits the state in a variety of ways all the way around the board. It was really unfortunate that in 2017, the year that we were theoretically going to do that, we certainly didn't come close to doing anything along those lines. And so that's why I think it's kind of unrealistic to think that with the fiscal cliff coming as it is, with the dollars amounts what they are, the kind of political issues that are on the table, and the fact that we're inching closer to election year, that we're going to have any real chance of doing any significant tax reform. And again, I think that's kind of unfortunate. In terms of the tax reform, there's a variety of things we've talked about and things that we could do. But I think one thing that we do need to kind of keep sight of, and it's part of it's going to be, I think, at the heart of the discussion during the session, is we do seem to have this big gap in terms of what we're collecting in sales tax and what we are collecting in income tax. By far, those are our two largest sources of income. I mean, you look at the pie chart, there's no question, you put those together, that's well more than half of what we collect in terms of state general fund revenues. I mean, corporate is so small. Mineral has gotten to be about, I think, 4.3 or 4.5% of our entire budget. So while we keep, a close eye on mineral revenues and those types of things, it's really, the price of oil doesn't really have as much to do with the direct income that we have in the budget and those revenues, because it's only, 4.5%, something like that, of our budget right now. Where it really makes a difference, though, is on the sales tax and on the income tax side, because if we've got the low oil prices, those are the things that are really feeding our budget, is the employment, the spending, and all those things that happen as a result of those things. But we do have this gap of, about $1 billion, a little less than $1 billion, between what we collect in sales tax and what we collect in income tax. And I think it was our view on the task force that we really did need to kind of narrow that gap, that we need to push down some of our dependence on the sales tax, kind of adjust and upward our need for income taxes. It puts us more in line, I think, with other states in a lot of ways, but it also actually gives us more sustainability and more stability for the future. We don't want to get in one of these situations that we've been in the past, for sure, where, with every little fluctuation of things, we're constantly falling behind in terms of even the growth of the normal economy. And so for those reasons, I think that those are the kind of tax reforms that we would like to see. Again, unfortunately, I don't think that we're going to see those during this session. I do think that to some degree we're going to have probably a combination, if I had to use my crystal ball, some kind of combination of lowering some of the sales tax, maybe cleaning some of those pennies, maybe keeping portions of those the cuts or the reductions to the tax credits and exemptions that we did in 2015. Certainly see some in the way of budget cuts. I think you're going to see some of that for sure. Probably not at huge levels, but I think you'll see something in the form of budget cuts. And then I think you'll see something on the budget side that the House Republicans have been kind of pushing in terms of the transparency and some of those changes in Medicaid. And I think it's interesting to note on those things that the governor has been somewhat open to those things. He was at the lobby meeting the other day, and basically he said he was not opposed to the transparency piece at all, and that they're willing to look at that somewhere along the line. I think there's some issues there in terms of the technical aspect of it and the cost that still need to be worked out, and that's something they can fight about during the session. But I think you'll probably see something along those lines there. And even on the Medicaid side, where you would think that a governor who is a Democrat would be somewhat reluctant to kind of push down some of those areas with co-pays and eligibility and some of those other things with the Medicaid program, the work provision that they have put out, that he's expressed an openness to doing that. And in fact, there have been conversations going on, I know, among some of the providers, healthcare providers out there, to try and see if they can come to the table to make that work in terms of the co-pay piece. And you've also heard that DHH has been looking at some of the eligibility things. So it seems like there is some movement there on those pieces of it too. Again, what it's going to look like when all is said and done is pretty hard to just predict at this point. But I do think the major things are on the table. We can probably see which ones those are. Probably not much done on the way of income tax, but certainly on the sales tax and some of those tax credits and those types of things. And we'll go from there. Of course, the other fight, I think, is going to be over how much do we raise. There's the question looming out there about the fact that we've got the federal tax reform that's happened, or tax reduction if you want to call it that. We will accrue revenue to our state because of that, because our personal income tax in Louisiana is tied to the federal piece. And of course, that's one of the things the task force recommended, that we get rid of that tie and dependence that we have on the federal tax code, because it impacts our tax code whether we choose to do things with it or not. But it is going to have a positive impact, and we've seen some revenue numbers that have been put out by the fiscal office, but they don't show the revenues coming in that much in the short term. They come more in the year after the budget year that we're going to be looking at in 2019. So we'll just have to see how some of those things accrue in terms of dollars coming in, and what the legislature is going to be willing to accept in terms of the amount of revenues that they will put on the table. But again, it's plenty of things to argue about. It's all out there. The call seems to cover just about everything everybody has talked about for the most part, even if some of those things are likely never to even come up. But I think we'll have a couple of weeks of real robust debate and discussion, and with any luck whatsoever, we'll have a positive outcome that's probably not the long-term solution that we're looking for, probably not the tax reform that we've been thinking about, but probably some blend of temporary, some permanent, tax revenues and some budget reforms, if you want to call it that, that'll get us through at least for another short period of time. Hopefully that will send a strong enough message to, again, the bond rating agencies, and actually, in the economic development world, that we are trying to do some things to bring sustainability and stability to our budget after really basically a decade where we haven't had that. It's time for us to do that, and I hope we will at least take that first step then in this coming session, knowing that we still have some work to do on the tax structure side in the future. But we'll wait and see on that. I think just to kind of close, I know we're jumping ahead a little bit to talk about the regular session, but I thought I'd just touch on a couple of things for that, because it's not that far away, actually. There's been a lot of discussion about TOPS. Obviously, the task force has been meeting since, I guess, the fall, looking at the issues surrounding TOPS, maybe some ways to do it better, ways to do it differently. They issued some recommendations the other day, but as you can see by the way the committee operated, that task force, they couldn't come to any agreement either. There was no real consensus, and just as that task force, I think, was divided in terms of what they see TOPS being, what their goals for TOPS are, I think the legislature is the same way. And I think, if anything, 2016 was probably an education to legislators in the fact that you mess with TOPS very much, you get a lot of pushback. And I think the fact that they cut TOPS during that year, and it affected students and families and those who had done a lot of planning, who had stepped up a lot of the recruiting of our students, our top high school students from universities and other parts of the country, particularly our kind of competitors here in the South, I think is a sign that the legislature is probably going to be very reluctant to do much, if anything, in the way of changing TOPS. I think the fact that kind of went with decoupling the TOPS revenue piece from the tuition piece probably means to most legislators that they're kind of content with that. It kind of tamps the increases that we saw year after year in TOPS. I think we're not going to see much in the way of tuition increases that are going to be pushing those up. You may very well see some fee increases at some of the institutions, but I think most of the schools, or a lot of the schools anyway, are pretty much maxed out in terms of what they can do with tuition. Not all of them, but they still have some fee authority, and those that have will probably utilize that, but that's not going to impact the TOPS cost. And I think when legislators look at that and look at these proposals, they're probably going to end up punting on making any major changes. That said, I would say that it doesn't mean that there aren't some improvements we could make in TOPS, and quite frankly, if we were starting our TOPS program all over from scratch, or we didn't have it and we were creating it brand new, it's probably doubtful to me that we would have created the program that we ended up creating with a relatively modest GPA and ACT requirement to do that, the very high cost to the state to do those things. But that being said, I think we're pretty well seen most of the changes that we're going to see to TOPS for the short term, probably the long term as well. The thing I'm a little bit disappointed in, we still, I think, have some issues on the needs-based side. Whether TOPS is the mechanism to address needs-based is probably doubtful. I think most people or I would say most, a lot of people in the legislature don't feel like TOPS should be a needs-based program, that it was designed as a merit-based program, at least a modest merit-based program, and it should continue along those lines. But I do think in the bigger discussion, we need to continue to take a look at some things that we can do on the need-based side through the GO grants or some other student financial aid to students who have that financial need. We have raised tuition a lot in our state over the last 10 years. We've raised fees a lot over the last 10 years. We've also got some of the lowest educational attainment rates in the entire country. We know that we need to have basically all of our students who graduate from high school go on to get some kind of post-secondary credential, whether it's a 4-year, a 2-year, or a skills-based kind of credential of that variety. We know we need to help our students that have that financial need do that. And we've been pretty much tapped out in terms of that needs base for a number of years. While TOPS has grown to approaching $300 million, our GO grants have been stuck at probably about $26 million for the last number of years. And as that number stays flat, it also means that more people are trying to apply for it, so the awards actually go down. So it's less meaningful to those students that need it. Hopefully somewhere along the line we'll see some improvement there. And finally, I would say, we're involved a lot of K-12 education issues, and I don't see the session coming up this year as being a huge year in terms of K-12 things. I think the state has put a number of reforms or changes in place over the last few years that still need some time to settle. Obviously, we raised standards a few years ago. We've kind of tweaked the testing and the assessments that we've been doing, so that's kind of been in place. Last year, we made some changes, some pretty big changes, significant ones, dealing with the federal ESSA law that passed, that all states have to do some things differently. So that stuff is still being implemented and kicking in. So I don't see a whole lot there on that front. What I do see, though, is the same thing that we've seen a lot in the past, where there are going to be attempts to kind of water down some of the things that we have done over the years, particularly with our accountability. I don't see a big package from the governor to be doing those things. I think it may very well come from a lot of his allies in the legislature, but I don't really see the administration making a big push on any of those things along those lines. I do see some legislation coming that'll be taking some more pot shots at John White. We'll see what happens there, but I think those things have kind of become kind of normal parts of the legislative process. And lastly on that, I do think that you'll see some more focus on early childhood education, early education, especially for children birth to 3, where we've not had a huge policy area. I mean, we did make some big changes a number of years ago in 2012 when we passed Act 3, which had a lot to do with early education and kind of creating a framework for accountability and higher quality within the entire child care system in our state. So not just pre-K and the 4-year-olds, but also in our child care centers and all the other early education centers that we had. Unfortunately, the problem there is we didn't have any money to help fund it or to help some of the families that have needs in terms of getting their kids into these higher quality programs, because as we raise the quality of these programs, as we most certainly need to do, that also increases the price. And by the way, I don't have any kids, certainly not at that age, but I'm around people that do, and child care is a very expensive thing. It's a huge workforce issue as well in terms of the needs that parents have, in terms of taking care of their kids, making sure that they are in good settings. And I think it's becoming a broader issue that I think the legislature needs to understand. I think we did a pretty good job a number of years ago of educating legislators about pre-K in terms of the 4-year-olds and that type of thing. I think we need to kind of go back, and especially since we have a lot of newer legislators in there, talk about this early education piece, the birth to 3, those other kids that really need to be in quality education, child care centers, and those types of deals. And I know there's no money. I know there's not a lot of revenue that's available to do that. But I think like anything else, it's an education process. You almost have to start what I might consider a multi-year campaign to raise awareness and understanding of that issue, so that even with limited resources, right now it's not a high priority, I would say, with most legislators, not because they don't care, but mostly because they don't really understand it. They don't understand the nuts and bolts and the mechanics. So I think if we can bring people in, some faces, and Beth, we did a thing, of course, couple of weeks ago on Public Square, where we had John White and the business community and folks on there. And we also had child care providers as well as parents. And I think we had some very good discussion during that program about how parents are affected, how the child care centers are affected, how all these folks are impacted. And we had some really good discussions after we turned off the cameras, because people were able to kind of vet a little bit more. So what I think is you'll see some of those kind of things showing up at the legislature, where some of these folks who are directly impacted will be able to come and make their case, for some of these types of things. The legislature is very aware that we have a waiting list. If you say waiting list, they know exactly what you're talking about. For all those folks that are waiting for waivers in the developmental disability community, I bet hardly any of them know that we have a waiting list of more than 70,000 people who are trying to get some kind of assistance with child care to try and help them put their kids in these quality settings. So I think we're going to do a lot, or try to begin to raise awareness about that in the coming years. So with that, I will just stop right there and see if y'all have any questions on your mind, and I'll be glad to try to answer them, or at least weigh in to some degree if I can. So thanks very much. Yes?
Hi, sir. All right, so just to start off very broadly, do you think there's enough of a firm ground between legislators and the governor here to make this by whatever you would consider to be a productive special session?
Okay, the question was whether I think there's enough, agreement or whatever among the legislators and the governor to try and make this a productive special session. I actually think there is. Now, I don't think that the governor and the legislators are there yet. I don't think that. I don't think there's any evidence to suggest they're there yet. But the fact that they're having the conversations that they're having, the fact that some of the conversations behind the scenes with, as I mentioned, Medicaid providers and others that would be affected by some of the things that are being talked about, the fact that those discussions are going on leads me to believe that they are, at least within the ballpark that they can come in for a couple of weeks and try and get something done, accomplished. So from my own personal view, I'm cautiously optimistic that this session will at least get us to some way of addressing the fiscal cliff, probably not permanently, and probably not the way I think our organization or a lot of other groups would say is the best for the state, but it'll probably get us over the hump. And then we'll have another hump to come, because probably some of these things will be temporary, and certainly what I don't expect to see is a lot of reform out of there. So that's a battle to fight for another day. But I do think that we have a chance of actually solving this problem in the short term in a way that is at least acceptable to two-thirds of the legislators, and enough for us to live to fight another day.
So what do you compare it? Sorry, just to follow up to the 2016 session in which the temporary tax was raised. Do you see that repeating here?
Compared it to the 2016 session where the temporary taxes were raised, what I think, and this is just kind of what you're seeing in some of the feedback that you're getting, is that there probably will be some of these taxes that would be done on a permanent basis. You could see some of the tax credits and exemptions, some of those things that have been reduced, seeing those things continue maybe on a permanent basis. I still think there's a group, for a variety of reasons, some I might say are political, but some I think I understand where they're coming from in terms of some fiscal issues, where they want to keep some temporaries, keep some of that on the table so that we can revisit some of these things later, that they come and have another bite at the apple. And I think, quite frankly, there are some that would prefer to do, the longer-term tax reform if we are going to do it with another governor if they have an opportunity. There's no guarantee they're going to get another governor after the election, but I think some people are trying to, hold their powder a little bit and say, let's see if we have another governor, in a couple of years, and maybe we'll see about doing some things there. So I don't think it'll be like 2016 exactly, but I think it'll be a combination of some permanent and some temporary taxes. Lane.
Barry, the governor, obviously in January 2016, there was a revolution in the House, independently elected speaker. The governor told me and Liz the other day that it's not working. What is your opinion of that, sir?
That what part is not working? The independence of the House?
Yes.
The question is, the independence of the House is not working. And I'm sure from the governor's perspective, that is absolutely true. It's not working the way that he wants it to. But Lanny, to be honest with you, ever since I've been around the legislature, and Brenda, ever since you've been around the legislature, weren't they always talking about an independent legislature? Well, We got one, at least one house of it. And we'll try it and see how it works. I mean, it's the same with Congress. You don't have the same thing in that regard either. And I mean, you know, it's hard to go make the argument that what we had before was better, where the governor just chose everybody. De facto chose the speaker, de facto chose the committee chairs, and then had all of that. You know, from some people, that didn't look like good government either. And so now, because the House is picking its own leadership and not the governor's leadership, or we just say that's bad government? I mean, the legislature has a certain amount of authority that is granted to it by the Constitution, and the fact that it chose to exercise it for the first time ever, or some of it for the first time ever, you know, I guess we'll just wait and see. But I can certainly see from the governor's point of view that he doesn't feel like it's working. But that's kind of democracy. That's just the way this stuff works.
There was some talk about some lawmakers that perhaps a special session after the regular session would have been more productive because they know more about revenue, the RECs and what was going to come out of that, and maybe even oil prices, although they really shouldn't rely on that. What were your thoughts on perhaps an early versus later session?
Well, the question was about an early special session like the one we're going to have in February versus one after the regular session in June. I think we absolutely had to have it in February. And here's the reason why. I mean, we're always going to have questions about the revenue piece, or how much are we going to get because of the federal tax changes, all of those things. I mean, there's always a reason that you can have some uncertainty about some forecast in the future. Oil prices, the same thing. That doesn't solve a problem. That's just always going to be there. I think the thing that is driving this as much as anything is that if we didn't have it in February, and if we don't fix the problem, at least to some degree, I put fix in quotes, in February, then we'll have a almost 3-month regular session with a budget on the table that makes $1 billion in cuts that they are not going to pass, and is just going to put negative attention on our state to show that we can't get our act together, that our legislature and our state government is dysfunctional. And then we'll have to come with a really short, very hard deadline at the end of the regular session in June with, you know, dealing with a fiscal cliff issue, knowing then that if you fail at that, then maybe we have a government shutdown at the state level. I don't think any of that was really very appealing to the legislators themselves or to whatever. And actually, I think the governor is right. I mean, in terms of the issues, not much has changed. What has changed is we know we're going to get a little bit of an automatic tax increase because the federal tax changes, where that's going to be a part of it right there, and there's really not much you can do to change that because that's a constitutional thing. And we know that the other side, the Republican side, has brought some things to the governor that that he can take a look at that will kind of satisfy them. So other than that, everything else is basically the same as it has been. The tax ideas are the same. There's only so much you can do in terms of revenue sources because they are somewhat limited. We can't wave a magic wand and make oil prices go up or any of those other things. So I just think that the February session makes sense for a lot of reasons, and I do think that, and hope very much that they are successful with it.
Senator Kennedy has stated that the state has $4.3 billion in statutorily dedicated funds that can be easily undone by a simple majority vote of the legislature. John Bell Edwards, when he was campaigning, I have video footage of him actively saying he would pursue that avenue. Can you state as to why, you'll have to speak to whether your group has looked into that versus strictly looking at tax reform, but can you speak as to why that seems to not be even on the table by anyone and it's not being pursued? I mean, you had, Jay Darden did show up and poured total cold water on the idea, referring to and then Treasurer Kennedy as a quote Senate wannabe. So can you enlighten us as to why that side of the equation is apparently not being studied, statutory dedications, and repeating them to where these cuts can be spread out over a much broader spectrum?
The question about statutory dedications and why that has not been looked at or whatever, I would say they have looked at it. The committees have been, I think, for some period of time taking a look at some of these things in a broad sense. But here's the issue with that. Just because you can do it, it requires the legislative will to do it. And even though they have talked about it and the dedications have been talked about for whatever period of time, unless you can get either a majority of the legislature for a statutory dedication or 2/3 of the legislature with a vote of the people to actually make those changes, you just don't get anywhere. And the other part I would say is, you know, all of those things, again, have constituent groups, and they were dedicated for a reason. And it doesn't mean that I agree with all of those, that they were the right reason, but for whatever political thing or for whatever other thing, they have been put there, and the legislature has affirmatively said, we want to protect those with extra protection. And in some terms, in cases with the Constitution, the voters have said the same things. I mean, to be honest with you, on a lot of the big ticket things that are constitutional dedications, I just don't see them, or the people, we the people have dedicated all of those things. And I don't see that the appetite is there when you put those things out there to say, do you want to take away this dedication to protect the coast? Well, they're not going to do it. And, so I do think people have taken a look at it, and I do think there are opportunities to do some things there, but I just don't think there's been a legislative will on most of those things, because when you look at those issues, the legislators are saying, I'm fine with that.
Well, not to put words in your mouth, would it then be saying the path of raising taxes is an easier path?
I don't know if raising taxes is an easier path. I think that's almost something you have to ask them. I mean, we've been doing this, really, let's be honest, we've been doing this for about a decade right now, almost a decade. And we've had different groups of legislators in, 2 different governors, all kinds of opportunities to do this and to make some other structural changes that people have been talking about as well, to close universities, to change the way higher education operates. We've had all kinds of people to throw those things out and to debate those, and we're still where we are right now. So that suggests to me that there's either no political will on any side of the equation to do it, or that they've decided that they kind of want to leave things as they are.
Barry, it seems that in our conversations about various alternatives, we don't even have a conversation based in the same facts. Meaning, is there a role that cable could play to lay out how do we rank in terms of personal income tax? How do we rank in property taxes? Just, a set of actual facts, because you see things tossed around all over the place. I was, how do we rank in terms of tuition and our, just do a ranking of how we actually stack up. It's like a backgrounder piece before the conversation. You feel sometimes like we don't have that. You may have it in your task force, but it's not out in the public consumption. Does cable need to play a role in that?
Well, maybe that's a good idea, Susan, now that you mentioned it. The question or the statement was about having, a good set of facts out there on a variety of these indicators dealing with our taxes and tuition and other things like that. I mean, you're right. I mean, actually, I think a lot of it is out there, and maybe there is a role for us or for others to kind of pull that together. I mean, mostly we've all been using the data from the Tax Foundation because it's a national group. They look at every state. They're a pretty fiscally conservative group. They do a variety of different comparisons. And, in terms of how you want to look at things, we rank either, on the tax burden side, we rank pretty low. On the income tax side, among states that have an income tax, we rank pretty low in terms of our dependence on that or how much we raise. On the tuition side, at least within the Southeast, we rank still fairly low, even though we've been raising tuition. And maybe there is a way to kind of put some of those things in a context. I do think, a lot of the legislators realize some of those things, but that's just, it's been a really tough nut to crack. I mean, the one that still continues to get to me, and I mentioned it earlier, but it's still, to me, very troublesome, is that it's great to have a low tax burden for a variety of reasons, for economic development, for attracting people. You could argue the opposite on some other things, but I'm just using that argument. But if our tax business climate, our business tax climate is also bad, there's a disconnect there. If we're low in tax burden, we also ought to be very high in terms of our tax climate, and we're low in both. So it seems to me it doesn't take a whole lot of thought to think, well, that we need to do some things to say if we got a low tax burden, we're going to have a very good tax climate. And you do that by making some of the recommendations that our task force made. But
I think 2 recommendations that they should be passing out of the task force.
2 recommendations that they should. I mean, I think the biggest ones mostly have to do with some of the things that we've been talking about. Lowering the sales tax. I just don't think it behooves us to have the highest state and local sales tax in the country for a variety of reasons. We're a poor state is one, but also just having that, it starts to get your attention, and it starts when people are looking to come in here and you say, oh, 10% sales tax, 10.5% sales tax, some places it's 11%. That's just not a good thing to have. So, I mean, I think our recommendation to try and lower the sales tax, make up for it with some changes in the income tax, kind of like a Stelly version. It wouldn't be the same as Stelly, but it'd be the same principle where you're lowering the sales tax, getting rid of huge deductions that we have on the income tax side, but also lowering the rates while you do that. When you get rid of deductions, you can lower rates, and you can do that on the individual personal side, and you can do it on the corporate side as well. I think just those two things right there would move us up very high in those rankings of the tax foundation. I mean, I think there's some other things too. One of the bigger things, I mentioned earlier that some you could do in relatively short term and some are long term, but I think this is something people don't recognize either. I mean, we in Louisiana do a lot of things at the state level that other states do at the local level. And it's just a fact. Now, you can say it's right or it's wrong or whatever, but that's the way we grew up. And I use the easiest example. In Texas, we always compare to Texas. Texas has a huge, sprawling community college system. It's been there forever. It's very well thought of, and everybody points to it as an example. They pay for all of their community colleges at the local level. The state appropriation is minuscule compared to what is all done at the local level. We do all of that at the state level. We do the same with our health care, whereas a lot of these other places don't have a state health care system the way we have. I know we got rid of the charity hospitals per se, but we still have a state-run, Medicaid program that it brings all those dollars to the state. In other places, they do it at the community level with public hospitals, but they're at the community level. We have supplemental pay, we have constitutional, you mentioned constitutional dedications, we have constitutional dedications that send dollars to the local level for roads, for money from video poker, supplemental pay again for police and firefighters and sheriffs. All of those things are state obligations that we have to do at the local level that most states don't have to do. And so when you compare us, it's really hard to make some of those comparisons unless, we change the way that we do business. And that's a really tough nut to crack. But, the other one is the, the tax credit, inventory tax credit. That is a local tax that is collected at the local level, and we pay it back at the state level, essentially. That's another state obligation that we have that other states don't have. So that, to me, is a big long-term reform. If we could try and find a way to kind of reduce some of the reliance the local government has on the state and turn it over to them, but also give them the flexibility to do what they need to make ends meet on things.
You should be espousing that then, and is anybody leading the charge on that?
We tried. It doesn't get very far. I mean, frankly, if you look at all those players that I mentioned, okay, look at all we do, $3.5 billion or more to the school boards. Well, the school boards don't want to change anything. We probably shouldn't on that in terms of the dollars that we spend on public education. But the sheriffs, the police, the firefighters, they're not going to go for it. The municipalities, the parish, the police jury, they're not going to go for any of those things. I think theoretically we can look at it and say, hey, if we give you some more flexibility to take care of your own business, but also turn over some responsibility to you at the same time, would you go for that? Well, I don't really want to go for that, That's kind of the attitude I think we've always had in our state, where it's much easier to go to the state and make that argument and try and get it there than have to, go to taxpayers or go to somebody else. Yeah.
With regard to the bargaining chip, the Ohio checkbook that you referenced on the Republican legislature side, I wasn't there, and I don't like to try to relate when I wasn't at the meeting, but I'm told that Commissioner Garden last week kind of put up an initial red herring that it may not be nearly as easy to implement in Louisiana because of computer systems and track things of that nature. Again, I didn't hear him verbatim, but in your assessment, do you believe that it would be realistic to recreate an Ohio checkbook for Louisiana? And could there be a scenario whereby we told that it would, taxes get enacted, and then all of a sudden, well, we just don't have the capability to do this or anywhere near what the Ohio checkbook is?
Well, the question's about implementing the Ohio checkbook in Louisiana, which is basically a very transparent website that they have in Ohio that allows people to basically look at almost every expenditure that's made in state government through the website. And I have looked at it. It's very user-friendly. I mean, you know, if you're into that stuff, it could be like a video game that you get addicted to, because you can go find out how much everybody makes or how much everybody put on their credit card. I mean, you can dig down pretty deep. I mean, I think that something will happen during during the special session that addresses the transparency issue. I didn't hear Commissioner's comments either. I saw some of them in the newspaper. I do think that we have some technology issues in our state that are real, and we've had them for some period of time. And frankly, if this is a way to try and help us also, besides have the transparency, to also get some of our IT stuff better updated and better talking to each other, look, I'm all for it. I think we ought to take advantage of both of those things. I don't know if we can do it as quickly as they were able to do it in Ohio, but I do think we can get something started on it, and hopefully it's something that we could continue to, you know, persevere on. I do think it's going to be hard to do it overnight, but I do think if we make a commitment to do it, that's something that would actually have a large benefit for the state. I was going to get him first because he had.
Yeah, you mentioned something earlier about our local taxing authorities, but if the local taxing authorities went ahead and did what the governor's pretty much begging them to do right now with regard to the ITEL program, do you think, and vigorously came up with vacancies to, make those determinations, do you think in the long run that would be a positive with regard to your operations in attracting business? Do you think it would be negative? Do you think?
So you're talking about kind of completing or continuing what we're doing now with the local involvement in the ITEP program? Is that? I think, actually, I think there's very good potential there for that. I honestly do. And I think there's been, some rap that, businesses are not behind that or whatever. And I don't think that's quite the case either. But I do think one thing that you do see in other states is that they have a very organized, very understandable process for going through that. And I think because we're kind of making a transition from an old way of doing things that was all at the state level to all of a sudden kind of throwing it to the locals and say, okay, here you go. Well, that's not working out so well either. I do think that if we can, and I think it does take some leadership at the top too from the governor and the state in that deal. But if we can kind of simplify and make very clear those processes and what, the industry or what the business folks need to do to go through that process, the arguments they need to make and who they need to make them to and that type of thing, I don't see why that can't work. I mean, it works in other states. And we've done it differently. I think businesses would be willing to go along with something like that. Again, it'd be great if we could do it where it was kind of the same way in most places, that you didn't have to jump through a different hoop in whichever jurisdiction you were in. But we're still kind of making that transition, and I think we'll see how that goes. But I think that's, to your point, I think that's a possible thing that could help local governments.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah, just to follow up on the Ohio checkbook comparison thereof. The price tag on it, do you think that's going to be an issue for the more fiscally minded members of the legislature? Because obviously that has developed some concerns over the past few weeks that we've been talking about this.
Yeah, the price tag on the Ohio checkbook thing, I think it's going to be an issue, and I think part of the first issue is to figure out exactly, what the cost is. I mean, I don't see this, quite honestly, happening overnight, like I mentioned. I mean, I think it's going to be a multi-year thing. So I think what you'll see in terms of the revenue is a fight over how much is enough to get us started. But to continue all the way through, I think it is going to, take some degree of money, largely because we're just not equipped to do anything like that now. I mean, we're not like technology central here in Louisiana in state government in a lot of ways. And so I think on the one hand, we need to kind of raise the bar to get to that level, and then you've got to go on top of that. So I think it's going to be a discussion, but I do think there's going to be a big push for it, and I think we'll see something pass that at least begins to address it or to get the ball moving forward on it.
Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, John.